We're coming towards the end of our series on heroes of faith. Today I want to celebrate a local saint. On the south side of Southminster's east window is somebody looking like a Victorian Church of England bishop with an ornate cloak, a mitre on his head, and carrying a crook, a crozier, in his right hand. And there's a similar window in Bradwell Parish Church. Next to this person is the chapel of St. Peter on the Wall at Bradwell. And there's a legend that this man not only built the chapel, but he also built a church in the place that eventually became known as Southminster, the place that was for the monks on the south side of the Dengie Peninsula. And the name on the window is correct, Cedd, though he probably wore a rough habit like that of St. Leonard on the left-hand side of the Southminster window. Sometimes he's called Bishop of London. Probably he preferred to be called Bishop of the East Saxons. So, who was he? And why was he a hero of faith? The little that we do know about him comes from the writings of the Venerable Bede in the 8th century. He wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Cedd was born in Northumbria of a noble family, brought up with his three brothers Chad, Cunobil and Caelin by St. Aidan and the monks of Lindisfarne. All four became priests, and Chad eventually became the first bishop of Lichfield. Aidan came from St. Columba's community in Iona. He followed the Celtic Irish pattern of worship and came across to Lindisfarne and taught a luxury-free life, careful reading of the scriptures, and being ready for the return of Christ. Rather than the continental system of a prince-bishop organising a diocese, the Celtic Church depended on monasteries supporting travelling bishops whose main job was telling the story of Jesus. And right from the start, Cedd, whose name was probably more likely pronounced like Keith, Cedd, was an evangelist. He was sent by King Oswy of Northumbria to the Middle Saxons, part of the Kingdom of Mercia. Taking 3 other priests with him, he baptized King Peada, who agreed to become a Christian so that he could marry King Oswy's daughter Alchfrid. Cedd also brought many other people to Christ. But there was a fresh call. King Sigebert of Essex had asked Oswy for help. His predecessor was a pagan who had driven out Mellitus, the Roman Bishop of London. And Cedd was sent to restore Christian faith in Essex, including London. And Cedd came to the former Roman port of Cirencester, now called Athona. Like Iona and Lindisfarne, it was remote. It was ideal for a monastery where new people could be trained and sent to the people with the gospel. And all that remains now is the chapel where Cedd's community met for worship. And Cedd spent a year in fasting and prayer, and then he used the building materials that the Romans had kindly left behind when the legions were returned to Rome in 410 AD. The monastery was there as a place of formation. It also provided theological support for the travelling bishop, who was the chief evangelist. Céad learned well from Aidan. He became tough and he became fearless. An influential, rich landowner made an unlawful marriage. What made it unlawful, I don't know. But it was an unlawful marriage, and said Céad banned him from worship and told people that they were not to go anywhere near this person. And when King Sigebert continued to visit the sinner, Céad rebuked him and prophesied, "You will die in this house." And later Sigebert was murdered in that house by Swithelm, a pagan who then became king. And by this time Céad had reported to Aidan's successor Finan in Lindisfarne, and Finan made Céad bishop of the East Saxons. Wherever the people were, there was Céad. That was the Celtic pattern. And Céad travelled and found Swithelm and baptised him. And Swithelm may have converted for political reasons. He depended on the king of East Anglia, who was a Christian. Céad built other churches and a further monastery at Tilbury. And then he was called away at the request of sub-king Ethelwald of Deira. Deira was at the time all of Yorkshire and Durham, from the Humber to the River Tees. And Céad obeyed Finan. He travelled north, built another monastery out on the Yorkshire moors, and became abbot of Lastingham. And although he was abbot, he never forgot that he was a missionary bishop and regularly travelled to Essex to evangelise. Céad's brother Chad looked after the place when Céad wasn't there, and became abbot himself when Céad died. But Céad had one more huge task to fulfil. As I've said, Céad follows the Irish Celtic practices, but there were others who followed the Roman practices. And there was disagreement particularly about when you should calculate, or how you should calculate, the date of Easter. The Celtic Church used an old method. The Mediterranean churches used two new ones, but all three were difficult, gave contradictory answers sometimes, and caused friction. Particularly, they caused friction between King Oswy of Northumbria and his queen, because they used different methods to calculate Easter, and they celebrate it on different days. So they called a council at Whitby. The delegates there spoke 5 different languages: Old English, Old Irish, Old Welsh, Frankish, and Latin. Céad was the one person who had both the right skills and the trust of all the others. So he translated accurately and without bias. And when the king chose the Roman way, although it wasn't the way he preferred, Céad accepted the king's verdict. And then he returned to Essex as its travelling missionary bishop. He went back to Lastingham in 664 and then caught plague. He died on the 26th of October. In 1954, when celebrating the 13th anniversary of St Peter's Chapel, Chelmsford Cathedral changed its dedication from the Church of St Mary to the Cathedral Church of St Mary, St Peter, Cedd and the Saints of Essex. So, what was he? A church and monastery builder, a missionary pioneer, a trainer of missionaries, a fearless speaker of unwelcome truth to kings, a trusted interpreter. Cedd was a hero of faith.